On February 15, 2024, an 11-year-old girl named Audrii Cunningham left her home in Livingston, Texas, expecting to catch the school bus like any other Thursday morning. She never made it to school. Within hours, her backpack was found abandoned near a dam. 5 days later, her small body was pulled from the Trinity River, bound with rope, weighted down, and discarded like trash. The man responsible was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was Don Steven McDougal, a 42-year-old family friend who lived on the same property as Audrii and her father. He was someone they trusted, someone they let into their lives, someone who had been alone with her countless times before. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Trust is a fragile thing. We give it freely to those who seem safe, who smile at our children, who offer help when we need it. But what happens when that trust is a carefully constructed lie? What happens when the person you welcomed into your home, the person your child knew by name, is the one who takes everything from you? This is not a story about a random act of violence. This is a story about betrayal at its most intimate and unforgivable level. This is the story of Audrii Cunningham and the man who destroyed her family from the inside. Livingston, Texas is a small town where everyone knows everyone. It is the kind of place where neighbors help neighbors, where children play outside without constant supervision, where trust is not just given but expected. Audrii Cunningham was a bright, energetic 11-year-old girl who loved school, loved her friends, and loved life. She lived with her father in a mobile home on a rural property, the kind of place where space is abundant and privacy is a given. It was a quiet life, unremarkable in its simplicity. But on that same property, in a separate trailer, lived Don Steven McDougal. McDougal was not a stranger. He was a family friend, someone who had known Audrii for years. He was someone her father trusted enough to allow him to live on their land. He was someone who had been around Audrii since she was a small child. He was someone who, on the surface, seemed harmless. But beneath that surface, something dark and twisted was growing. Something that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. On the morning of February 15, 2024, Audrii was supposed to catch the school bus at the end of her driveway. Her father had left for work early, as he did most mornings. Audrii was used to this routine. She was responsible, mature for her age, and capable of getting herself ready for school. But that morning she never made it to the bus stop. When the bus arrived, Audrii was not there. The driver waited, as drivers do, but eventually moved on. At first no one panicked. Maybe she was sick. Maybe her father had taken her to school himself. But as the hours passed and Audrii did not show up at school, concern turned to alarm. By mid-morning, Audrii's family realized something was wrong. Calls were made. The school was contacted. Friends and neighbors were asked if they had seen her. No one had. Audrii had simply vanished. The Polk County Sheriff's Office was notified, and a search began immediately. In a small town like Livingston, the disappearance of a child is not just a tragedy for one family. It is a tragedy for the entire community. Volunteers flooded the area, searching fields, woods, and roads. Helicopters circled overhead. Search dogs were brought in. Everyone hoped for the best, but deep down, a terrible fear was growing. Within hours of the search beginning, a critical piece of evidence was discovered. Audrii's backpack was found near Lake Livingston Dam, roughly 10 miles from her home. It was not hidden, it was not buried. It was simply there, abandoned, as if someone had tossed it aside without care. The discovery of the backpack shifted the investigation from a missing person case to something far more sinister. If Audrii had run away, she would have taken her backpack. If she had been in an accident, the backpack would have been with her. But the backpack was alone, discarded, a silent witness to something terrible. Investigators immediately began to piece together Audrii's last known movements. They spoke to her father, who confirmed that he had left for work early that morning and had not seen Audrii before he left. They spoke to neighbors who had not seen anything unusual. They reviewed security footage from nearby homes and businesses, but nothing conclusive emerged. The timeline was frustratingly vague. Audrii had been home, then she was not. Somewhere in that narrow window of time, something had happened. But what and who was responsible? As the investigation intensified, attention turned to the people closest to Audrii. In cases like this, the perpetrator is almost always someone the victim knows. Strangers do not typically abduct children from rural properties in broad daylight. The person responsible is usually someone with access, someone with opportunity, someone who knows the victim's routine. And in this case, that person was Don Steven McDougal. McDougal lived on the same property as Audrii and her father. He had been there for years, a fixture in their lives, someone who was always around. He was not a relative, but he was close enough to be considered family. He was someone Audrii would have trusted without question. He was someone who could approach her without raising alarm. He was someone who had every opportunity to be alone with her. And as investigators dug deeper into McDougal's background, a disturbing picture began to emerge. McDougal had a criminal history. He had been convicted of enticing a child in 2007, a crime that involved luring a minor for sexual purposes. He had served time in prison and had been released, but the conviction remained on his record. Despite this, he had been allowed to live on the same property as an 11-year-old girl. He had been allowed to be around her, to interact with her, to have access to her. The question that haunted everyone was simple. How did this happen? How did a convicted child predator end up living next door to a vulnerable child? The answer, as it often is in these cases, was a combination of misplaced trust, lack of awareness, and systemic failure. Audrii's father may not have known the full extent of McDougal's criminal history. Or perhaps he did know but believed that McDougal had changed, that he had served his time and deserved a second chance. It is easy to judge from the outside, to say that this should never have been allowed to happen. But in the moment, in the context of a small community where people help each other, where second chances are given freely, the decision may have seemed reasonable. It is only in hindsight, when tragedy has already struck, that the warning signs become glaringly obvious. On February 20th, 2024, 5 days after Audrii disappeared, her body was found in the Trinity River. She had been bound with rope, weighted down, and submerged in the water. The discovery was devastating. The hope that had sustained the community for 5 days was shattered in an instant. Audrii was not lost. She was not hiding. She was dead. And the manner of her death suggested something far more sinister than an accident or a moment of panic. This was deliberate. This was calculated. This was murder. The autopsy would later reveal that Audrii had been killed shortly after she disappeared. She had not been held captive for days. She had not suffered prolonged torture. But the fact that her death had been quick did not make it any less horrific. An 11-year-old girl had been murdered and discarded like garbage. Her life had been stolen from her before it had truly begun. And the person responsible was someone she had known, someone she had trusted, someone who had been part of her everyday life. Don Steven McDougal was arrested and charged with capital murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His phone records placed him near the location where Audrii's backpack was found. Surveillance footage showed his vehicle in the area around the time of her disappearance. Forensic evidence linked him to the crime scene. And perhaps most damning of all, rope found in his possession matched the rope used to bind Audrii's body. There was no doubt. McDougal had killed her. But why? What drives a person to murder a child they have known for years? What goes through the mind of someone who can look at an 11-year-old girl, someone who trusts them, and decide to end her life? These are questions that may never have satisfying answers. Psychologists and criminologists have studied cases like this for decades, and the conclusions are always the same. People like McDougal are driven by a combination of deviant sexual impulses, a complete lack of empathy, and a sense of entitlement that allows them to view others, especially children, as objects to be used and discarded. McDougal's previous conviction for enticing a child suggests that his interest in Audrii was not new. It is likely that he had been grooming her for years, building trust, establishing himself as a safe presence in her life, waiting for the right moment to act. Predators like McDougal are patient. They do not act impulsively. They plan, they calculate, they wait, and when the opportunity presents itself, they strike. On the morning of February 15th, 2024, that opportunity presented itself. Audrii's father had left for work. Audrii was alone, preparing to catch the school bus. McDougal knew her routine. He knew she would be vulnerable. He knew he could approach her without raising suspicion. And he did. What happened next is a matter of speculation, but the evidence suggests that McDougal lured Audrii away from her home, possibly under the pretense of giving her a ride to the bus stop or helping her with something. Once he had her alone, he killed her. Then he disposed of her body in the river, weighted it down to prevent it from surfacing, and returned to his trailer as if nothing had happened. For 5 days, McDougal lived on the same property where Audrei's family was desperately searching for her. He watched as volunteers combed the area. He watched as helicopters flew overhead. He watched as Audrei's father pleaded for information. And he said nothing. He did nothing. He allowed the family to suffer, knowing full well that Audrei was dead, knowing that he was responsible. This level of callousness is almost incomprehensible. It speaks to a complete absence of humanity, a void where empathy and conscience should exist. When McDougal was arrested, he initially denied any involvement in Audrei's disappearance. He claimed he had not seen her that morning. He claimed he had no idea what had happened to her. But as the evidence mounted, his story began to fall apart. Investigators confronted him with phone records, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence. Eventually, the weight of the evidence became too much to deny. McDougal was charged with capital murder, a crime that carries the possibility of the death penalty in Texas. The trial, when it came, was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution laid out a clear timeline of events, supported by physical evidence, witness testimony, and expert analysis. The defense had little to work with. McDougal's criminal history made it impossible to argue that he was a man of good character who had been wrongly accused. The forensic evidence made it impossible to argue that someone else was responsible. The only question was whether McDougal would receive the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the end, McDougal was convicted of capital murder. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a guilty verdict. The sentencing phase was equally swift. McDougal was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars, a fate that many believe is too lenient for what he did. But for Audrei's family, the verdict brought a measure of closure. Justice had been served, even if it could never bring Audrei back. The murder of Audrii Cunningham raises uncomfortable questions about trust, safety, and the systems we rely on to protect our children. How did a convicted child predator end up living on the same property as an 11-year-old girl? Why was there no oversight, no monitoring, no intervention? These are questions that demand answers, but the answers are often unsatisfying. The reality is that our systems are imperfect. Sex offender registries exist, but they are not foolproof. Background checks exist, but they are not always conducted. And even when warning signs are present, they are not always heeded. Audrei's father has had to live with the knowledge that he allowed McDougal into their lives. He has had to live with the guilt, the what-ifs, the endless replaying of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but proved catastrophic in hindsight. It is a burden that no parent should have to bear, but it is a burden that he will carry for the rest of his life. And while it is easy to judge, to say that he should have known better, the truth is that predators like McDougal are skilled at deception. They are skilled at presenting themselves as trustworthy, as harmless, as safe. They exploit our natural inclination to see the best in people, to give second chances, to believe that everyone deserves redemption. But not everyone deserves redemption. Some people are beyond saving. Some people are so fundamentally broken, so devoid of empathy and humanity, that they can never be trusted. Don Steven McDougal is one of those people. He had been given a second chance after his 2007 conviction. He had been released from prison, allowed to reintegrate into society, allowed to live a normal life. And he repaid that second chance by murdering an 11-year-old girl. The case of Audrii Cunningham is a stark reminder that evil does not always announce itself. It does not always wear a mask or lurk in the shadows. Sometimes evil is the person next door. Sometimes it is the family friend. Sometimes it is the person you trust most. And that is what makes it so terrifying. We want to believe that we can protect our children, that we can keep them safe, that we can spot danger before it strikes. But the truth is that danger is often invisible until it is too late. Would you have trusted Don Steven McDougal if he lived on your property? Would you have allowed him to be around your child? These are not easy questions to answer. In the abstract, it is easy to say no, to say that you would have done a background check, that you would have been more cautious, that you would have kept your child away from him. But in the reality of everyday life, where trust is necessary for community to function, where people are given the benefit of the doubt, where second chances are part of our cultural fabric, the answer is not so clear. Audrii Cunningham was a child who deserved to grow up. She deserved to go to school, to make friends, to fall in love, to pursue her dreams. She deserved a future. But that future was stolen from her by a man who saw her not as a person, but as an object. A man who had been given every opportunity to change, to become better, to prove that he was not a danger. And he failed. He failed in the most catastrophic way possible. The community of Livingston, Texas will never be the same. The trust that once defined the town has been shattered. Parents are more cautious now, more vigilant, more aware of the dangers that can hide in plain sight. Children are taught to be wary, to question, to never assume that someone is safe just because they are familiar. And while these lessons are necessary, they are also tragic. They represent a loss of innocence, a loss of the simple trust that once allowed children to play freely, to explore, to live without fear. Audrey's mother, who did not live with her at the time of her death, has spoken publicly about her grief. She has described the unbearable pain of losing a child, the guilt of not being there to protect her, the anger at the man who took her daughter's life. She has also spoken about the importance of awareness, of vigilance, of never assuming that someone is safe just because they seem trustworthy. Her words are a warning to other parents, a plea to take the threat of predators seriously, to never let your guard down, to always prioritize your child's safety above all else. But even with all the awareness in the world, tragedies like this will continue to happen. Predators are skilled at deception. They are skilled at manipulation. They are skilled at exploiting trust. And until we as a society develop better systems for identifying and monitoring dangerous individuals, until we prioritize the safety of children above the comfort of adults, cases like Audrii Cunningham's will continue to occur. The rope that bound Audrey's body was not just a physical restraint. It was a symbol of the control that McDougal exerted over her, the power he wielded, the complete disregard he had for her humanity. It was a symbol of the betrayal that defined her final moments, the realization that someone she trusted was the one hurting her. And it was a symbol of the failure of the systems that were supposed to protect her, the failure of the adults in her life to recognize the danger that was living right next door. Don Steven McDougal will spend the rest of his life in prison. He will never again have the opportunity to harm a child. But that is cold comfort to Audrey's family. It does not bring her back. It does not erase the pain. It does not undo the betrayal. It is simply a recognition that justice, however imperfect, has been served. As we reflect on the murder of Audrii Cunningham, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we live in. We are forced to acknowledge that danger can come from the most unexpected places. We are forced to accept that trust, while necessary, can also be deadly. And we are forced to ask ourselves, what would we have done differently? Would we have seen the warning signs? Would we have protected our children? Or would we, like Audrey's father, have made the same tragic mistake of trusting the wrong person? These are questions that have no easy answers. But they are questions we must ask, because the alternative is to remain blind to the dangers that surround us, to continue trusting blindly, to continue believing that tragedies like this only happen to other people. The truth is that they can happen to anyone. They can happen to you, they can happen to your child. And the only way to prevent them is to remain vigilant, to question, to never assume that someone is safe just because they are familiar. Audrii Cunningham's life was cut short by a man who should never have been allowed near her. Her death is a tragedy that could have been prevented. And while we cannot change the past, we can learn from it. We can demand better systems for monitoring dangerous individuals. We can prioritize the safety of children above all else. And we can honor Audrey's memory by ensuring that her death was not in vain, that it serves as a wake-up call, a reminder that trust must be earned, not given freely, and that the safety of our children is a responsibility we can never afford to take lightly. The Trinity River, where Audrey's body was found, continues to flow. Life in Livingston, Texas continues. But for those who knew Audrey, for those who loved her, nothing will ever be the same. The wound left by her death will never fully heal. The betrayal will never be forgotten. And the question will always remain, how could someone we trusted do something so unforgivable? Don Steven McDougal had every opportunity to be a better person. He had been given a second chance after his 2007 conviction. He had been allowed to live freely, to integrate into a community, to be part of people's lives. And he chose to use that opportunity to destroy an innocent child. That choice defines him. That choice is his legacy. And that choice ensures that he will be remembered, not as a man who made mistakes, but as a monster who preyed on the most vulnerable among us. If you were Audrey's father, could you ever forgive yourself? Could you ever move past the knowledge that you allowed a predator into your child's life? These are questions that have no answers, only endless torment. And while we can offer sympathy, while we can acknowledge that he too is a victim of McDougal's deception, we cannot erase the reality of what happened. Audrey is gone. And no amount of guilt, no amount of regret, no amount of what-ifs will ever bring her back. The murder of Audrii Cunningham is not just a story about one child's death. It is a story about the fragility of trust, the danger of complacency, and the devastating consequences of failing to protect the most vulnerable among us. It is a story that should haunt us, that should make us question our assumptions, that should force us to confront the uncomfortable reality that evil can hide in plain sight. And it is a story that should serve as a warning. Never assume that someone is safe just because they are familiar. Never let your guard down. And never, ever underestimate the capacity for human beings to betray the trust placed in them. Audrii Cunningham deserved better. She deserved a life. She deserved a future. She deserved to be protected. And the fact that she was not is a failure that we all must reckon with. Because if we do not learn from her death, if we do not change the way we think about trust and safety, then her death will have been for nothing. And that is a tragedy we cannot afford to repeat.